Hi, my name is Erin McDonald, astrophysicist, writer, and television science advisor. Thanks to my last video on the three main types of faster-than-light drives out there was an overwhelming response for the science of hyperdrives from the Star Wars universe. Now, the way I like to describe hyperdrives in this universe is a sort of weird hybrid between warp travel and wormholes. Basically what's happening is when the ship engages the hyperdrive, it builds its own wormhole as it travels through. So where did I get this idea? Well, before we get into the Star Wars of it all, we have to give a brief refresher on Spacetime so we understand what we're talking about when it comes to hyperspace. If you want to skip all of this, you can just go to the timestamp down below. Spacetime is the term we use to describe the universe around us, a four-dimensional fabric that's made up of three dimensions in space, forward, back, left, right, up, and down. We can then control our movement in those dimensions. And then there's a fourth dimension of time that we don't have any control over, where we move forward at 1 second per second. I call it a fabric because that's how scientists and mathematicians were able to derive concepts such as gravity wells, black holes, and wormholes. So, we have this fabric, sheet, trampoline, whatever works best for you. Mass sits on the surface of this sheet. But we're really just giving a representative image for what's actually going on because this mass is really inside the sheet. If this gives you a headache, a more three-dimensional representation is like mattress springs. If I was to reach my hand inside the mattress, I could grab a bunch of the springs together and make a fist. This would be like the mass disrupting the fabric of the springs or space-time. So we're gonna try to stick with the fabric/trampoline idea for now because it makes it the easiest to visualize. Hyperspace is a catch-all term in the Star Wars universe for the area above and below the sheet outside of our space-time. Other science fiction uses terms like subspace, null space, jump space, and a lot more. It's easier to picture with the trampoline, but if you're sticking with the mattress idea, this is the space between the springs. So there's also a fun way to think mathematically about hyperspace. And you can skip ahead about 10 seconds if you don't want to deal with math and complex numbers, and that's okay. But basically, I like to think of subspace or hyperspace mathematically as an analog to imaginary space. Do you remember imaginary numbers? Well, you can actually do a lot of fun math things with them. Essentially, our universe is the real plane, and then you can think of hyperspace as maybe the imaginary plane. Okay, complex plane math discussion is done. So there's one more science thing we need to briefly touch on before we get to the Star Wars of it all, which is tachyons. Yes, tachyons. They don't just come from the Star Trek universe, they are an actual theoretical particle that does weird things to space-time. Essentially, they have exotic mass or inverse mass. So while normal mass, like you or me or a planet or a spaceship, dip the fabric of space-time down, creating a gravity well, tachyons invert space-time like a negative mass. Normal mass is limited by how quickly it can travel through normal space-time, by what we call the speed of light. When a particle has no mass, it just coasts on the fabric surface at a fixed speed. But because these tachyons are inverting space-time, they are always moving faster than light, like creating their own wave to surf on. Okay, now let's get to the fun stuff. Not that that wasn't fun, but, you know, space battles. So how does the hyperdrive work? While most of my time is spent thinking about Star Trek and warp drives, transwarp conduits, and the like, I'm also a huge Star Wars nerd, and I do have quite a number of technical manuals for this franchise as well. Poking through these manuals, some are technically so-called Legends canon. The one that has the most detail is, of course, the Millennium Falcon, our favorite little Corellian YT freighter. And here we note these details: a hyperspace integrator and a warp vortex stabilizer. Okay, great. We can imagine a couple things with this. But if you looked at the Legends specs for the hyperdrive, which had an SSP-05 hyperdrive generator, the blueprints showed a flow of supraluminous particles. So let's break down what those mean. A hyperspace integrator, we can imagine, is literally integrating the ship with hyperspace, right? You have to make that transition between normal space and hyperspace. Next, we have a warp vortex stabilizer. Where I read this is that a warp vortex would literally be like a wormhole, at least pulling off the image of a vortex like a whirlpool or tornado, and we could sort of picture a wormhole from that. And of course, this warp vortex that the ship is building needs to remain stable. Kind of like how the nacelles in Star Trek keep the warp bubble stabilized as it travels, this component would need to keep the warp vortex, or the wormhole, stabilized. Finally, we have the supraluminous particles, or supralight hypermatter particles. Tachyons. Supra is a prefix meaning above, and luminous means light, so hypermatter could literally be another word for the exotic, currently theoretical matter that makes up tachyons. Altogether, we can picture the ships accelerating to near light speeds, engaging their hyperdrive, which initializes the flow of superluminous particles that invert spacetime. The hyperdrive integrator makes the transition into hyperspace, and the warp vortex stabilizer maintains the wormhole that the ship is creating as they travel through. Does that work? I hope so. I really like it. And I do think it summarizes the wild amount of technobabble that we find in some of these technical manuals. Another concept that the Star Wars universe uses when they talk about hyperspace travel is the use of hyperspace lanes. So what's the point of having lanes, or one can assume roads, if your ship is going to be making its own tunnel as you travel? This is where I get super nerdy and excited, because it has to do with what Star Wars calls gravity shadows. Going back to our discussion of space-time and what happens when you introduce mass, putting a bowling ball on a trampoline, you can imagine that the distortion of space-time due to the mass does create some interference in the hyperspace region.
Without precise calculations, we'd fly right through a star or bounce too close to a supernova and then end your trip real quick, wouldn't we?
Of course, you can look at this and think, well, why don't they just go on top of the sheet? But remember, we shrunk down the space-time dimensions so we could conceptualize it better. So if you have all these projections of massive objects invading your hyperspace region, there would be pre-mapped areas that would make sure your ship's journey isn't disrupted by a sudden space-time disruption in your way. This concept is so well laid out in the Timothy Zahn book, Thrawn Alliances, where using gravity shadows to disrupt hyperspace travel is actually a main plot point. Spoiler alert. Here are some excerpts from the book. While the primary purpose of the gravity projectors is to block traffic through the hyperlane, it is seldom that a marauding people ignore a chance at plunder. This hyperlane is sparsely traveled and its parameters and edges are poorly defined. I believe it more likely we've run into the shadow of some previously unknown mass. We have already seen their goal of closing off this region to easy and rapid hyperspace travel. The gravity projectors are effective, but they are costly and have only limited range and lifetime. Far more efficient in the long run to move lunar or planetary-sized masses into hyperlanes, where they will continue to disrupt travel for decades or centuries to come. So you may have already imagined that gravity projectors would be a way to project an image of a massive object of a massive gravity well. I'm not sure if moving lunar or planetary-sized masses into known hyperlanes is actually more efficient, but I'll trust them on that one. I hope too the awesome image from The Last Jedi where the Holdo maneuver rammed a cruiser into the dreadnought by traveling into hyperspace might also make a little more sense. The way I see it, by entering hyperspace directly in the path of a ship, it creates such an immense and sudden space-time distortion that neither ship can compensate for it. Now, we're not here to debate the merits of The Last Jedi because that maneuver looked awesome. It works for how we understand hyperdrive travel, and frankly, look, in The Last Jedi, Mark Hamill has never looked hotter. Okay, so that's it for our quick overview of hyperspace travel in the Star Wars universe. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it made sense for you. I kind of made up a lot of this stuff myself, just based on the little technical nuggets that I've been given over the years, but feel free to leave questions or comments down below, and be sure to subscribe so you can catch the next video, whenever that may be, about space, spacetime, and science fiction. All right, until next time, may the Force be with you.